If I give you an example of something quite dramatic, in Abu Dhabi, all the operations are linked. Everybody needs each other. So there's about 6, 7 plants all operating service together. What that means is that if you go out of service in one of those operations, everybody shuts down for that period. That's a cost of $6 million for every 24 hours. Paint is truly a drop in the ocean comparative to the lost profit coming from that operation being in the shutdown situation. So you can see these sorts of calculations, they're very interesting to do. They give you some idea of where you're putting your money, and it can even help you talk to your financial director to increase your budget. But in the big picture, the loss that's being seen from the production is much, much greater, and all the rest becomes null and void. So we have to think in a slightly different way. So what is the cost of paint? It says in the presentation title, what is the cost of paint? And that's very difficult for us to do. Now, I saw in the previous presentation lots of lovely, correct formulations. This formulation has no basis in reality whatsoever. That formulation is just an indicator of the value of coating as opposed to the cost of coatings. The value of coating is keeping your asset operational for as long as possible without any issues of corrosion over its lifetime, or the lifetime of that coating at least. And because we want to go in the direction of asset lifetime extension, and we see this very much, I mean, living in Norway, as you say, I mean, I'm not Norwegian, but I'm enjoying the Norwegian lifestyle of lots of oil money per capita. I think you have something of that in Australia as well, actually. But they have a problem because in the North Sea, they designed their platforms to last 25 years. And that was already 30 years ago. So now we're into lifetime extension programs. But of course, because they're platforms, they're offshore, they've also got weight issues. So it becomes a complicated calculation of how much does that paint weigh. The thing is that that's irrelevant, because if you have corrosion problems, you have to take that operation out of service anyway. So it's much more important to think then in terms of what is the value of the coating, not just the cost. So here you hear me talk really like a paint man, selling you the idea, pay more for your paint, which I'd love you to do. But actually, if that's a given factor, if we have already decided that, right, let's calculate the value of paint, let's see what shall we do? We want to spend more money on the paint system. How can we get a longer life out of this paint system? We don't start by improving the paint. We start by improving the work before the paint, meaning cleanliness and preparation. The sheer cleanliness has so much to say. I would say cleanliness is more important than the surface profile you put on the steel to paint it, in most cases, because that's one sure way of buggering up your paint, to use the technical term. So I would always look at making sure that it's a clean surface and that your preparation is done well. And that's fine, you need to control it. So I'd like to see more effort and money put into quality control, so that it's not just left to the paint maker, local rep, to turn up and say, that's not good enough, let's do it again. Because that poor guy hasn't got an awful lot of power. We in our company, we don't call them inspectors, we call them advisors. We call them advisors because our guys out in the field are not able to actually stop a job. We're not actually legally allowed to stop them and say, redo it. That's not our job there. We're not paid to do that. We're paid to say, if you want a good result, we recommend you do this. So having employed a proper quality control guy to control that coating system, to make sure, what I've said in red here, that everything that you've got on your paper is actually done in practice, is very, very important. That activity of controlling it is important because it will be done then. Because the guys who are doing the work, they're fairly, I have to say, they're fairly simple people. If they know they're going to be controlled, they will do a good job. If they think they can get away with it, I have to say they probably will try to get away with it. And the senator mentioned just now, it's all the work that's done overseas. If you think it can be done badly here, you've not seen anything till you've been to some of the countries I've been to and see them do it really badly. So it's definitely worthwhile controlling it, and that's a big fight. But then again, I'm trying to sell a bit of paint in a way here. Because if you're doing the job right, if you're spending the effort and time to control it, to make sure your documentation's right, to make sure your specification's right, you've controlled everything, how can you do something about going forward, making sure the paint's going to do the job you want it to do in the long term, or even more than you want it to do? And I've used the term future-proofing. I talked about it last year. I think it's a very interesting way of looking at things. How do we know what the future is holding? Do we have a crystal ball? I'd love to have a crystal ball. I probably wouldn't be here. I'd be gambling. But anyway, if maybe paint is gambling, I'm not quite certain. Future-proofing means what could happen to my facility in the future. If it's an oil facility, crude oil is becoming more sour, it's higher viscosity, you need to heat it in order to manage it. It means that if the temperature is going to increase of my facility to operate properly, I want a coating system that can handle it. Now that might mean upgrading the resin system of the paints. So you may be using a Novolac or a phenolic type of system as opposed to a normal standard epoxy. You might even say, would it be a good idea to increase the technology level? And it's a sort of a stupid thing to say for a chemist, increase the technology level. But in some ways, going from an epoxy, which is your bulk standard workhorse for our business, up to a polyester or a vinyl ester can give you certain advantages. Broad statements, and you have to be very careful with broad statements because they're always wrong. But in the right situation, a vinyl ester can do a much better job than an epoxy. But the opposite might also be true, so you have to be a little bit careful. You might say, and I'm in Australia, I have to admit, zinc silicates is probably the #1 primer that you use out here. And I've shaded myself from the, because I want to see who's nodding. Who likes zinc silicates in the room? I'm looking at you, Ted. Zinc silicates are, without question, if you have the right environment, the best primer you can have under the rest of your coating system. But I said, had the right environment again. Zinc, of course, by nature, is quite an expensive system, so you're increasing the cost. I wouldn't say dramatically, but there is that aspect of it. But you also need an electrolyte for a zinc silicate to work, so you have to understand, what are we trying to do here? What are we protecting against? If you're in the middle of the desert, a zinc silicate's not going to make any difference to you. It's not going to help you, unless you have a lot of humidity and condensation. So you've got to be aware of your environment before you choose the coating system. So choosing to upgrade based on the resin could be the right thing to do, could well give you benefit in the long term, but at the same time, could be a huge mistake, could shorten the life. So you have to be aware of what you're doing. And then I hope that the paint maker you choose to go to can give you good advice of what is the right way to go, what is the best way to do it. That's important. The easiest way, and perhaps the cheapest way to give yourself an upgrade on the paint system is to go for other pigment systems. And I've put up 3 examples. I'll come to those in a minute. Aluminium's been the traditional one. And one of the things that I've discovered working in the paint business is that most of the paint companies, we've all started our lives working with marine and shipping. So all of them have some kind of background there. That's really the origins of where paint is required for corrosion protection are the ships. And you can go back to 1700 and something to find all that being discussed. So aluminium has been a mainstay for an awful lot of paint companies as a good anti-corrosive additional pigment. But it's only giving you an advantage in the situation of immersion or close to the seawater, close to water, because you're using it as a barrier. And it seems to give some other additional benefits as a pigment when you use it as the first coat, but it doesn't seem to give very much as the second coat. So it has its benefits, but be warned, because aluminium, it's quite sensitive to pH, high or low pH, and therefore will start to break down in the wrong environments. So when we come to onshore facilities, when we start to talk about a chemical environment, I tend to head away from aluminium and think about other things like micaceous iron oxide, because MIO, it's already done what it needs to do. It's in its lowest state, more or less. So you can, in principle, think of it as inert, and therefore giving you the advantages that you get from an aluminium, but in terms of a more inert system. So a chemical environment is more suitable. So if we look at those flakes, and we also bring glass flake into this, you can see that you're simply upgrading, very simple thing, a barrier, this long trip. And you all know about this, don't you? This has been talked about for a long time. But I sometimes wonder when I look at specifications and we have just regular colored pigments into it, whether we've forgotten what you're trying to stop here. When you're looking at corrosion protection, we're looking at stopping from basically the moisture getting to the surface to allow you to have all the different characteristics you need for ionic exchange, which is corrosion. So having this barrier effect is very useful. It's very handy. It's a small upgrade. It's a very small upgrade if you're using micaceous iron oxide or aluminium. It's a bit of an extra step when you go towards glass flake, because glass flake's going to give you some additional benefits. One thing is the barrier. The other thing is actually a certain amount of flexibility in the coating. So it gives a little bit. It can help with expansion and contraction due to heat, whether it's from daylight or whether it's from the process itself. It also has a tremendous benefit when it comes to abrasion resistance. And we see that just regular epoxy coatings, when you put in glass flake at the right sort of levels, you get a tremendous benefit in the way that it performs. So a glass flake is definitely a good upgrade. And I encourage a lot of our clients to look at using glass flakes to give those benefits. And yet the standards that we were looking at have very little information about the pigmentation and about using these as benefits when they talk about thicknesses and they talk about systems. So they're lacking somewhat in that respect. In the middle there, you see something called pacifying pigments. And those pigments worry me. They worry me, zinc phosphate especially. And the reason I put zinc phosphate up there is because I want to have a word of warning. Zinc phosphates will give you a very good passivation of any damages for a short period of time, which is very interesting when we're doing testing. Because testing, you normally do in a seawater environment, you put a scribe, you cut through the paint, and then you want that scribe to have as little rust creep as possible after, say, 6 months exposure in a condensation chamber or whatever. Zinc phosphate will help to protect that scribe. It's only 6 months. That's a short period of time. So the zinc phosphate does a great job of making your results in short-term testing look good. The problem is, in real life, zinc phosphates, by nature, sensitive to moisture, in a long-term system like an epoxy system, will actually start to help the epoxy system break down. So it starts to have the adverse benefit, if you like. It does the opposite of what you want. It will shorten the life of the epoxy coating if you put enough in. So if you're looking at a 25-year system and you put enough zinc phosphate in to actually help you for 25 years, you're putting so much in that once it gets active, it will destroy the coating ultimately. Slightly overdone there. The amount of zinc phosphate used in epoxy coatings is just a small amount, so it won't affect it too much. But still, to my mind, zinc phosphates don't belong in an epoxy coating. They do belong, however, in alkyds and short-term life cycle coating systems. So there is a place for zinc phosphates. I'm not against them completely, but in a long-term protection, they don't really belong there. And then we come to the zincs. And zinc is a whole topic in itself. That needs a long discussion, because what we're seeing is there's more to zinc that meets the eye when it comes to giving protection. So again, we have standards for zinc. We have standards of how much you need in order to do a good job. The problem is we do it by weight. And weight doesn't represent actually what's going on. And the amount of zinc that's available for giving protection depends on how it's built up into the coating system. So it's much more complicated than, unfortunately, the standards are able to represent.